Emily here. Thanks for joining us again at the Exhibitionistas podcast. This week, we're having a look at Aria Dean's Abattoir exhibition at the U.S.A. in London. Aria Dean's an artist steeped in philosophy and architecture and how they intersect with blackness. She provides so much food for thought, and I was introduced to a lot of work through her. For example, Georges Bataille, have you heard of him? He's a French philosopher from the early 20th century whose base materials theory perpetuated some pretty transgressive experiments in his own life. A bit shocking, to be honest. But it was great to see how Dean incorporated it with her examination of blackness. It isn't a bold statement to say that Aria Dean will be an artist that will be considered for years to come. In this episode, you'll hear the menagerie that surrounds Joanna and I while we record, cats, dogs, even a sheep bleating in the background, all part of the fun. Thanks again for joining. We're so glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hi, welcome back to Exhibitionistas. On this podcast, we explore an artist through the lens of their solo exhibition. My name is Emily Harding. I'm an art lover, an exhibition goer. In this episode, we'll look at the exhibition Abattoir, U.S.A! By Aria Dean at the U.S.A. in London, which is on until the 5th of May. As this podcast title implies, we love exhibitions, the ideas, the beauty, the provocations, and most of all, the experience. So I was one of those people during the pandemic who thought, hey, secluding at home isn't so bad. What was I thinking going out so much before? I can just hang out here on my own. Yeah, totally.
Guilty of that.
Exactly. And exhibitions, has been one of those things that I've come back to, obviously, in the past couple of years that remind me how wrong I was. I mean, of course, maybe I was right at the time, but kind of wrong in the long term. And this exhibition is no exception. It is an experience.
Hello, and I am Joanna P.R. Neves, the other exhibitionista. By the way, I noticed that on Apple Podcasts, they have transcriptions of our episodes now, all episodes.
Amazing.
And my name is usually Joannes Pyrenees. So I think that my name is unscrutable for AI, of which I'm very proud.
Nice.
So here I am, Joanna Pyronis, and I'm an independent writer, an art curator, and artistic director of Drawing Now Art Fair. I'm also working on a book, actually, titled Female Drawing Machines, to be published in 2026, and it is about drawing as technology from a feminist perspective. And so now that you know all about me, Emily, how was your week in culture?
Last night, on another level, I saw Civil War at the movie theater. So I know this was like, I was really not into, so I'm American, I saw the preview.
Really? No.
Yeah, it's
You
true.
Don't say.
I know. Shocking,
no
but
one could
true.
have told.
But so I saw the adverts and it looked like a Marvel movie take on a Civil War.
Yeah, same. I was like, is this a joke? What the heck is this?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm very curious to know what it was about and what you thought of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it all looked a little bit too close to the bone, but then my husband really wanted to go see it. And then I found out it was directed and written by Alex Garland, who wrote the novel The Beach, if anybody remembers that, and lots of other screenplays for movies. So 28 Days Later, and a movie that was based on one of my favorite books by Kazuo Ishiguro, Never Let Me Go. Did you ever read that?
Can I say, I was never able to move past from the first page. I tried reading it so many times. I think it's me. To quote Taylor Swift, which I don't listen to, the problem is me. But I think I chose the wrong time to read it. But each time I have it in my living room, like waiting for me.
Yeah.
And sometimes I pick it up and I'm like, I have no idea. I just am not made. It's not a fit. We are not meant to be together.
Fair enough.
But I'm sure the problem is me because everyone says it's amazing. So
there's pace and timing with things. Sometimes books leap out at you and sometimes they just hang out for a while. But yeah, it's not
In my
an easy
70s.
read. So the movie stars Kirsten Dunst and a really brilliant cast alongside her. And the brilliant part of it is that, I mean, it just, there's a lot more nuance than you would be led to believe from the trailer, and it walks a really fine political line ideologically. So, it's not trying to say, explicitly about the politics of the day. It's not trying to say, oh, well, surely this is right and this is wrong. There's kind of one, couple of kernels in there about it. But it's clearly flagging that this is a future we do not want. I mean, yeah. And I don't know if you know Kirsten Dunst's husband. He's
Yes, I love him
called,
so much.
yes, me too.
Jesse Plemons.
Jesse Plemons, exact. It's good on the big screen. It's one of those, I mean, there's,
Yeah, maybe I'll go, yeah, because I've been trying to see what could I watch on the big screen, because I've been watching stuff at home, which is not great. Yeah, because my weekend culture was, I have to say, I'm really taken by this guy who passed away on the 14th of March of this year. So I learned about him on Instagram, weirdly, obviously, as someone was announcing his death. I had no idea this man had existed before. So his name's Frans de Waal.
mm,
He was a Dutch primatologist, and he wrote these amazing books. He's really interested in the continuity between human behavior and animal behavior, especially primates, but he talks about all animals in his books. And there's one that I really, really love, which is called The Age of Empathy. He talks about empathy, and he deconstructs this idea that actually we blame on Charles Darwin, but actually comes from an economist who's called Herbert Spencer. And he is the one who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. It
whoa.
was not Darwin at all. And so he based on really bad readings of Darwin this whole notion of competition as the basis of society. And in The Age of Empathy, Frans de Waal talks a lot about this in relation to the United States. So I think it would interest you. It's really
Oh, wow.
interesting. But it's all through the perspective of animals. And I also learned in his, because I've been like listening to talks, looking on YouTube. You know how obsessive I am. So I just started like looking into everything.
Yeah.
And he talks about the fact that, so I learned something this week through him, that primates laugh and kiss. So usually people say that what separates us from the animal kingdom is that we laugh. But simians laugh. They laugh a lot,
Yeah.
actually. And
Right.
he talks about being in his office and listening and hearing them laugh. And they also kiss. So bonobos apparently it's more sexual, the kissing. It's like he
Yep.
talks about this person who was minding the a bonomo community and who let one of them kiss him. And apparently there was immediate tongue, it's completely
But
crazy.
they're like famously
So
horny, right? Bonobos are like famously horny. Is that?
yes, so the female bonomos apparently when like opposing groups start fighting, they go to the other side and they start having sex with the bonomo females, the opponents, females and males, and they stop the wars like that. So there's so many
Amazing.
interesting stories that I'm just fascinated. I'm still reading it. I bought two books. There's another one which is "Are we smart enough to know how smart animals are?" I mean, it's just another world. It's so nice.
So he just died last month, but when was he writing like the Age of Empathy? When is that from?
Well, he came into his profession, I think, in the 70s, 80s.
Okay.
So he said that that's really interesting because he actually said that basically primatology and animal behavior studies were mostly male, so mostly male scholars, and they were completely interested in conflict. That's what they were studying because they had this idea that animals were basically machines they didn't have emotions or affects, and they just, were studying the way they fought, and they were territorial, etc. And then some female scholars started coming in, and they were interested in care, they were interested in the way they structured their
Hmm.
societies. And suddenly a few scholars started saying, well, you know what, this conflict thing is not the nature of these animals. We're only seeing these animals through a very narrow scope. And so he decided to study conflict resolution.
Hmm.
And he has a lot of interesting things to say about that. It's really, really interesting because some things are very animal based, and others, and that's what he says, we are very close to primates. Like, we have the same psychology. He doesn't believe that our psychology and our social structures are that different, even our sexuality. And in that sense, it's really interesting, especially when you think about all these new tendencies of trying to incorporate Native American thinking and relationship to the planet into our own behavior. Say, for example, I think it was in New Zealand where they finally accepted a river to be seen as a person.
Oh,
So,
yeah,
this
yeah.
Native American thinking of personalizing minerals, organic life, animals, and that's really interesting, I think. And at the same time, he's a scientist, so he's not going to say things to please you. We've come to a point where we're finally understanding and opening up the scope on these issues, and it's
Yeah.
fascinating to read him. It's fascinating. So he
Wow.
talks about gender as well, and he says, like, 1 in 10 primates are sexually gender fluid.
Huh.
There's something that doesn't correspond neither to the female or the male gender, but mostly it's binary. But there's exceptions to that, and very different kinds of exceptions, like intersex, but also other behaviors. So it's really interesting, and he's very objective at the same time. He's not going to say, the politically correct thing, because that's not who he was.
Sure.
But I think he broke a lot of barriers. Not
That's so
alone, he
interesting.
quotes a lot of people in his books.
So you think of science as just presenting the information, but of course it is infused with politics, 'twas ever thus. That's fascinating. I'm going to check him out.
Well, now that we've spoken about our week in culture, I'm really, really excited to hear you on this, Emily, and to exchange with you about Abattoir. Well, to be honest, I have the leaflet from the exhibition, and it says Aria Dean Abattoir, and on the website, the ICA, it says Aria Dean Abattoir, and then in other places it says Aria Dean Abattoir USA exclamation point. So I don't know. It's kind of a
Yeah.
fluid title, let's say. But first, I'm really curious about Aria Dean herself. I mean, basically, she's a baby still. She's so, so young. Tell us a bit more about her.
Yeah, so she's pretty new to the art world. Aria Dean was born in LA in 1993. Her parents worked in the entertainment industry, which is super common. I mean, for those of you who haven't been to LA, it is a company town by and large. It's hard to find someone there who isn't connected to the entertainment industry in some way. But
Mm,
she's now
mm,
based in New York and LA. She's a critic, she's a curator. She attended Oberlin College in Ohio, which stood out to me because I'm also from the
mm,
Midwest, and they have a really formidable
mm,
reputation for its progressive liberal values. So it was the first liberal arts college to go coeducational, the first to admit African Americans. It has the oldest
mm.
continually run music conservatory. Lena Dunham, did you ever watch Girls? She's the creator
Yes,
of,
I
yeah,
did. Yeah.
she went there. I mean, it's like super, super. I
Oh,
mean,
so it's a very well. Does it connote, like, is it basically, let's put this in UK terms, is it a posh school?
yeah, yeah, it's a posh school. It is just as progressive as you can get, and it has a huge arts culture as well. But anyway, I mean, I think,
Mm,
I'm mentioning that because it seems like a lot of her ideas were incubated there. I mean, one of her first one of
Right.
her pieces that's ironic ionic, which is a column, was based off
Yes.
of a bit of architecture
Yeah.
that was on the campus.
By
And
Venturi. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. After obtaining a bachelor's degree in studio art at Oberlin
Uh-huh.
College, she returned to Los Angeles, taking a position as a social media strategist for the Museum of Contemporary Art. So, in many respects, Dean's early engagement in the digital sphere of an institution prefigured the question she posed around blackness within the emergent internet culture. So she examined generative and gratuitous workings of online cultural production, of how the circulation of memes maps onto blackness and the visibility politics of selfies. So she really dug into the complexity of what social media is and what that means through the lens of blackness, particularly. But I think, yeah, as we'll talk about, just, her production of images and, what that means, and ownership, certainly comes into her work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, she's an accomplished writer. I mean, I was so impressed by her because she decided to publish the writings, or she was asked to publish the writings she did in her 20s,
Yeah.
which is so incredible. So, Aria Dean is a young African American artist who studied not only art, but also philosophy and architecture. So she's incredibly accomplished. She has a transdisciplinary education.
So do you want to just, maybe the thing to do now is just to dig into the exhibition itself. Do you want to introduce that?
Well, first of all, about the exhibition, I'm vegan. So, of course, when I read Abattoir, which means slaughterhouse in French, I immediately thought, my imagination started overworking and thinking, what is this about? Because, vegetarianism and
Is this
veganism.
for me? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or maybe because my mind went immediately to the images of slaughterhouses that kind of propel people into veganism or vegetarianism. So I didn't really know what to expect, and I really did wonder if she was vegan. And then I went onto her Instagram, and I thought that I saw that her handle is LOL_prosciutto, and I thought maybe she's not. And then who cares? Only me, honestly.
Then who cares? Yeah,
No one cares. It's
exactly. But
really
it's
not
like
important.
maybe she likes vegan prosciutto, but vegan prosciutto is already taken. You never know. You never know.
Yeah, it could be plant-based prosciutto. Who knows?
There
Anyway,
we
there's
go.
USA
There
in the
we go.
title, so I thought, oh, this is perhaps a criticism of North America. We'll see. We'll see. So the exhibition is very clever because it starts with a text that I have to say I read really quickly because I don't like reading text before experimenting the artwork. And then you open two strange looking doors between hospital doors and industrial food storage doors. And
Mm.
then you're faced with an empty room with a huge film projection. So the floor and walls replicate the atmosphere of the doors. And the floor is a black linoleum with little circular protuberances. And then the walls have a sort of human height strip of a sort of a nondescript color, like grayish, greenish color. And then the lighter color up to the ceiling after that strip. So it is not a projection room. You are not in a projection room.
Mm.
So you have this uncanny feeling of being both in a projection space and in a recreation space. And for some reason, what I'm saying is triggering Siri. So triggering in the
Oh,
not in the psychological sense. So I'm gonna put my phone away from me on airplane mode, and I apologize for that if you
there we
heard it.
go.
So cheap.
Siri's vegan too. She's really triggered by this.
Exactly. So you're not really in a projection space. You're in a sort of recreation of a space that is nondescript at the same time. Could be many things. So psychologically, it kind of creates a void, so nowhere for your soul to be. But suddenly, personally, my consciousness was heightened because I was asking myself, where am I? What is this space that I'm in?
Mm,
And, you know, am I the one looking? Is someone looking at me? There is this uncanny feeling
mm.
of a presence of some kind. It's really, really clever.
Yeah, yeah, that room is really key. You wouldn't get the power of this film if you watched it on your laptop
No.
or your phone screen. Because, I mean, like you say, the industrial floor, the doors, they bring you into the film itself because you're looking at similar sort of a similar structure on the screen. And then for me, so there's at the end of this room, so you walk in this room through these big double doors. You
Mm-hmm.
sit down on a bench at the back of the room, you're looking at the screen.
Mm-hmm.
And then off down to the right of the screen, there's this open
Right.
doorway.
Right. Right. That's
It's
true.
lit from within
Yeah.
and it just feels mysterious. And as I was watching the film, it's like other people who'd been in the film before me kind of wandered back in
Mm.
there and then they came back out quite quickly.
Mm.
And it's like your mind starts going like, what's in there? Is it a broom closet or something that they just forgot to shut the door to or what? But I mean, that was also added to the level of what's going on in here
Yes.
feeling for
Yeah.
me too.
True. When I was there, these people went in and never came back. And I thought,
Oh,
okay, this because I don't think the exhibition continues that far. There's only two pieces to watch. And but maybe they kind of came back in, but I just didn't notice because I was so taken by the atmosphere. I don't know, but you're
yeah.
right. You're right.
Meanwhile, you're like, it's a portal. They've gone to the next dimension.
Yeah, there is that. Yeah, absolutely, indeed. There's a portal-like feeling, and you'll see because going back to the video actually, and it is weird that we get to the
Yeah.
video after really focusing on the atmosphere of the room. It's unusual. So the video is an empty slaughterhouse rendered through a 3D gaming software called Unreal Engine. So this also contributes to this uncanny feeling of being somehow part of the whole scenario because it's completely empty. There are no bodies whatsoever. So it
Hmm.
confronts real space and virtual space because there's elements of the room that are repeated in the film. And you somehow become the interface of it all, of this real space and this virtual space. And Aria Dean says something really interesting, which is that she thinks that only virtual spaces can talk about our real, or can talk about reality, or
Mm.
can do or produce reality in some ways. And she really makes you feel that. So the video takes you almost literally because it is this gaming software. So your mind clicks onto that atmosphere and you're supposed to play a role in it somehow in this kind of aesthetic created by Unreal Engine. So you go through a space with corridors until you see a bright light. It kind of almost explodes in your eyes. It's really beautifully made as well.
Mm.
As if you went like through a different dimension, like a portal. Of course, it makes you think of
Mhm.
death, but nothing is specific in this experience. So you don't know. You're the one making decisions and interpreting and producing the meaning somehow, along with the imagery, of course. So you get to another space with blood on the floor. There's the only person like or body like thing that you see. It looks like
Is there
sticky.
blood on the floor?
Yeah, it
I
looks
mean,
like a
there's
sticky
definitely, like, wet.
substance.
I interpreted it as wet,
Oh,
but I didn't interpret it as blood because it's like it covers the whole floor, right? I mean, which I guess I've never
yes.
been to a slaughterhouse, maybe blood does cover the entire
Well, this
floor,
is
but,
fiction. Yeah, obviously. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So again, you're right. Who knows? I saw it as blood, but it's not said to be blood. And
Mm,
anyway, it makes no sense because there's nothing there. It does have the apparatus of post death for the slaughtered animal because it has the hooks that you hang the bodies on. And the strange thing is that you realize at this point that you're the only living thing in this space and you're the
mm,
spectator. So you're powerless in some ways. you only have the power of imagination and of being taken into this quite manipulative thing, like a video game can be. But
Yeah.
there's this weird sensation of also being in an architecture, especially the corridor that leads you to that portal like impression of an explosion of light, that made me think of an artist who just passed away, Richard Serra's sculptures, the big iron sculptures that are.
Oh, yeah.
The only difference is that it's not as tilted as his sculptures usually are, but not all of them. And you go, I mean, I've experienced a few of them, and when you're in them, you have this feeling of as if the walls were coming
Mm,
in and kind of pressing onto your personal space. They're very strange sculpture, very effective when you think it's just basically
mm.
an iron spiral, for example. Really tall, they're very big. So some moments of the video made me think specifically of certain artists, but but that was, I didn't have a
Yeah.
lot of thoughts about that. It just made me think of the slaughterhouse, especially the corridor, because there's this autistic woman who, thought of a way to build those corridors so that the animal wouldn't know what they were getting into. And I thought, so much
Okay.
effort. Why just not convince people not to kill animals like this? At least not like this,
Yeah.
But anyway, because
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
obvious that the animals get really distressed because they understand what's going on and they see the previous ones, the ones walking in front of them being killed. So obviously it's a horrendous thing.
Totally. Yeah, yeah, I know they can sense it for sure. How could you not, I mean, they aren't born to be put through channels like
No.
this. I mean, they were born to go and graze on a bunch of grass,
Mm.
I mean,
And they're not machines
so
like
yeah, they must.
people, in this
Yeah.
time thought they were, like going back to Frans de Waal. They're not machines, and they
Yeah.
understand that if an animal in front of them is screaming or making a certain kind of noise, that
Oh,
means danger, So,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it is a very clean aesthetic for a gruesome place, and the way that the camera angle works is kind of in the beginning, you're sort of looking around,
oh yeah.
up at the ceiling, and there's sort of this beautiful Victorian glass ceiling, and you think, maybe the slaughterhouse was converted from like a huge greenhouse like they have at Kew Gardens or something like that. For example, it's Victorian and there's lots of Victorian flourishes around. So like there's some beauty to the building, but you're sort of looking up at the ceiling and then, the camera kind of pans down to this channel that the animal would have gone through, and meets this violent end. But you're seeing things primarily from the perspective of the animal, which I think, obviously any point of view of the camera, the viewer is going to have more sympathy with that point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, I think that's part of what makes it so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, then you're kind of drifting through the slaughterhouse and seeing it. But that notion of, her emphasis on architecture, her emphasis on space, and how that makes one feel is, yeah, definitely very profoundly felt in her work.
So there's also, like you say, I mean, you see things from the perspective of the animal, and I was being really literal. And because the film is in the loop, I'm not sure we arrived at the beginning of the film. So there's a moment, like you say, where you kind of up. There's this beautiful light, sunlight through this Victorian building, a little bit like the Crystal Palace. The sun rays go through the windows,
Mm,
and you kind of have an aerial view of things. And I thought, oh, it's the animal soul, but it's not. It's not.
yeah.
You are in a space where anything's possible. She's really interested in cinema and cinema theory. So you are in a space where you can float. Why not? There's no rules. It's a game without rules. So you don't know what game you're playing because you don't have a remote in your hand or a controller, and you can't have an impact on the motion of the camera. So you're taken in a place where usually you would be able to do something in this kind of aesthetic. So it's really interesting because you have moments where it kind of disconnects you from the point of view of the animal. It creates other meanings in some ways, and it
Yeah,
brings you
yeah.
back to your own identity as someone who is looking at a structure. And Aria Dean is interested in structures. But maybe we'll talk about this
Totally.
a bit later on. It's time for a break, isn't it, Emily?
Yeah, definitely. Let's take a quick one. Back in a moment. Well, welcome back, everyone. We've brought you in. You're in this kind of 3D gaming software slaughterhouse. I mean, I have to say, when I was watching
Yeah.
it, so I worked in the West Bank in Gaza for 5 years in a few years ago. And going through that did have some remembrances, some
Wow.
similarities to going through
You don't
Erez,
say.
which is the crossing between Gaza and Israel, kind of the north of Gaza. And I mean, obviously, Erez is not a slaughterhouse. I'm not saying that it is a slaughterhouse by any stretch, but when you're going through, it's absolutely full of channels like this, whether it's, fencing on both sides and on top of you to direct you to a
Uh-huh.
certain place.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, and sometimes, I mean, there is a lot of concrete slabs used everywhere. I mean, it's an enormous complex that manages movement to the extreme. I mean, you feel confined, you feel directed, you feel monitored. And that was coming back to me, certainly, as I was watching this
Wow.
piece by Aria Dean. I mean, look, people, when they get to the other side of Erez, are not being executed. So I'm not trying to make a similarity there. But
Yeah.
the similarity is certainly through
The
the amount
structure.
of control
Yeah.
of, yeah, exactly, the structure, the
Yeah.
amount of control and surveillance, of people's bodies. Yeah, it's really, and I mean, obviously there's a lot that, both Gazans and Israelis would have to say about that. But
Yeah,
for
for sure.
me, as a person, I mean, I remember going in, and you kind of go through this long, long corridor of, kind of the fencing on both sides and above.
Yeah.
And then you come in and you have to go through the metal detectors. This is coming out of Gaza rather than going in,
Hmm.
although it's, there's some similarities going in as well. But you get your metal detector, and then you kind of go through this little bit of a labyrinth where they have tiger traps.
You're
So it's
joking.
like you go, no,
Really?
you go in one door, and then you're kind of held in a very small area that maybe three people side by side could fit in. And then the next door is locked and it won't open until they sort of make whatever decisions they're making up in the control booth.
Oh, blimey.
And, at certain times, I mean, it has been where you get redirected to a different door that is locked and then opened when you get to it.
And I'm
And,
assuming you don't want to
that's
go
where
into that door.
that's not, yeah, exactly. That's where you get strip searched,
Yes.
Joanna. That's the strip search doorway. Yeah. So, I mean, but I mean, making light of it, look, Israelis will say that's absolutely necessary for security. And, October 7th, underscores that more than anything. And there's an argument to be made that that is, an intense amount of control to have over
Hmm.
human
Bodies.
bodies.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. But yeah, there is, not an exact simile, but certainly some similarities there.
Yeah, I think this idea of the structure is really what interests Aria Dean. I mean, from what I've read from her, and the parallel you're making is really interesting because it really is what she is focusing on because there are no bodies. So the hint you have is that you're looking at a very specific kind of structure with a very specific orientation and ability to lead you somewhere, and which is something that the image is also making. The comparison with gaming is really interesting. So to bring matters to a bit of a lighter, perspective.
Please,
um
yes.
yeah. So one of my sons is wants to study game art, and so
Oh, cool.
I went to a game art lecture. So the first question we were asked is, what is a game? And we
Huh.
had a
Wow.
hard time defining. Well, first of all, as parents, we're trying not to speak, but then obviously we started raising our hand. And so we got to a point where he was defining gaming as opposed to puzzles, as opposed to toys. And so the interactive element is really important. But then what makes, because, if you're playing chess, it's interactive. So, what's the difference between chess playing and gaming? It was really interesting. And then he got to define the fact that in a game you win. So, you have to win. So, you're interacting with some form of platform. It can be other people, it can be the computer, it can be AI, it can be bots, it can be whatever. But there's a set of rules. And you have to kind of overcome the hurdles that are thrown at you. It can be a shooter, it can be, jumping and getting something, it doesn't matter. And it made me understand how controlled the narrative is and how you are controlled as a gamer. But it also brought me
Yeah.
back to a class, a literature class, where the teacher had the bad idea of saying what makes a novel. So the structure that every novel has to have. And I remember that my soul
Mm.
fell to my feet and it completely broke
Oh,
my experience of fiction. And I thought, no, 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 no,
yeah.
no, no, no. And it's within the restraint that fiction happens. And that's really interesting because so Aria Dean is really focused on a theory called Afropessimism. And so Afropessimism bases their theory on the fact that Black bodies, through the invention of slavery, and not only in America, but way earlier before in the African continent, were completely othered in as much as they couldn't belong to the ontological structures. And so to be human meant to be not black. So humanism is
Yeah.
defined by the creation of these black bodies that could never attain the role of subjects and could never attain subjectivity. And therefore, society is built on those black bodies that render you human. And the slaughterhouse, the way she describes it, goes back to biopolitics, to Foucault's biopolitics, in this idea that these structures, these big industrial structures, actually are saying not who gets to live, but who has to die for you to exist.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's why the
Yeah.
slaughterhouse comes in. As a vegan, that interests
And
me.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, I think that that relationship to what is human is that came out to me in watching her film because as you say, there aren't any people in the film and there aren't any cattle or there aren't any animals going to slaughter either. There's nothing. But the structure is built as a liminal space to transfer cattle from being alive to dead, but it's not a liminal space for people who work there, and the whole space is set
Yes.
up for
Yeah.
this function of killing animals, for slaughtering them. And you can't imagine people actually going there and working, 8 to 10 hours a day. I mean, so I did some research in Minnesota a few years ago. I took a very late in life master's in comparative politics, and I did
Did
some
you
work looking
do
at.
did you do a geriatric master's?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. I
I
did a
was so
geriatric
old.
PhD as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
I
the
mean,
oldest
everybody else
in the group.
was so young, and it was just looking at their faces, like, unlined and fresh and optimistic, and yeah, I mean, really, it was shocking. I mean, like, by a long chalk. Everybody else they were plowbacks. It was like they got done with their undergrad and they were plowing right back into doing a master's. No, there was none older than me, I mean, even some of
Really?
the professors, it's like, yeah, I mean, I had them beat age-wise. So went and did this master's focusing on how to govern divided societies. But anyway, I digress. The research I did was looking at comparing Somali integration into rural towns in Minnesota. So Minnesota
Oh,
has a
yes.
huge population of the diaspora. The Somali diaspora are in Minnesota. And, so it was looking at kind of, how they were treated in these two places. But I mean, so many of them came to work in slaughterhouses and meat packing plants. And I mean, and not just Somali immigrants, obviously, but I mean, immigrants full stop. I mean, this was work that, was intolerable for the white population who had lived there for a long time. I talked to one of the small town mayors, and he was really pro. So this was kind of the main difference between the two towns, was there was a very pro attitude towards immigration and integration in one
Hmm.
and not the other, and it didn't go on political lines, which is really interesting. But he was, he said that a lot too. He's like, you think some of the folks here who are, say that they can't get a job, they could get a job, but it's going to be at the plants. And that's going to be, they're saying that that's unacceptable. Obviously that's, there's exceptions to what he's saying. But I mean, that otherness,
Yeah.
we're not going to do that. We're
Yeah.
going to get you to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's exactly what she talks about. I also read somewhere that the suicide rates of slaughterhouse workers is pretty high.
Oh,
It's a really gruesome work they do, for sure.
well, you
So
would say that you're a vegan. That's vegan
that's
propaganda right there.
propaganda. There's a book called Vegan Propaganda, which is absolutely incredible. So, actually, when thinking about structures, we have to talk about the architecture as well. So, the text at the entrance that I didn't pay much attention to, but is in the leaflet as well, is about the construction of this world. And it clearly states that Dean looked into the history of the buildings, of slaughterhouse buildings specifically. So, back in the day, like 2 or 3 centuries ago, they used to be adorned with features and weren't very different from other buildings. They were supposed to be beautiful and they were clearly marked as being slaughterhouses until Napoleon. So, Napoleon
Hmm.
decided that architecture and ornament should be removed from these buildings, which by the same token should be industrialized, regulated, but also taken away from sight. So the idea is that this is
Huh.
removed from visual, from our visual relationship to society, from existence, really. This, interestingly, this idea of not having any ornaments resonates very strongly with modernist tropes in terms of form and shape for buildings. So she mentions Adolf Loos, who was a famous Austrian Czech architect who wrote a book called Ornament and Crime, published in 1913, which
Hmm.
was a lecture before and then became a book, stating that anything superfluous should not be undertaken. So this was very specifically against Art Deco or Art Nouveau. So beauty for him was in the function of things, which also resonates with Bauhaus and all of the modernism that then comes into play first in Europe and then in America. So this was rather
Yeah.
exciting, for many people when I was younger and artists, including myself. The issue is that these notions came, and that's what she flags up in her texts. So this came at the same time as standardized production, Fordism, and I just learned that Adolf Loos was into prepubescent or pubescent girls because
Uh,
their bodies were pre-ornament,
uh,
as was Gustav
uh,
Klimt and Egon Schiele. So this was brought to
well,
my
Egan Sheila,
attention.
that's no surprise.
That's
I
no
mean,
surprise. But there's a
yeah,
whole
yeah.
group. It was an organized group. This actually, I learned about this from an MFA thesis that I supervised, and it really rocked me to my bones. The name of the student is Laura Fisher. She's also an artist, and she did an amazing work. Like, it was beautiful to work with her. So Dean here is amalgamating these references in a really interesting way echoing Afropessimism. So this idea that obviously these regulations were brought about for hygiene reasons, but this also means that there's a dismissal of a ritualistic part of life that suddenly
Yeah.
is taken away from society in terms of structure. And so the video echoes these different architectures across time.
Another mark of the film for me was this incredible score. Like, it
Yeah,
has great sound. I mean, you're sort of surrounded by sound, which adds to that feeling you talked about at the beginning of
true.
you know
Yeah,
what this room is and what's going to happen, and there's a really incredible score that goes along with it. And at a certain point, so when you're at the end of the channel and the light is flashing, and then
yeah,
you transcend to the other side of the flashing
yes.
light, there is a rendition of "I Think We're Alone Now" by
Na 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 na
Tiffany,
na na
which,
na
I mean,
only
yeah, new one.
sound.
Yeah. Do-do-do, 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 do-do-do. I mean, and it is so good. I mean, my teenage self was a huge Tiffany fan. Did she kind of penetrate Portugal?
Oh
Was she big
yes, did
there?
she? Yeah, did
Okay.
she
Uh,
penetrate? Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, it was a big deal.
yeah, yeah. But unusual choice, right? I mean, I
Unusual
guess
choice.
it's like if that's when the animal dies,
Yeah,
the animal is then alone
yeah,
in there wherever any spirit goes. That was the ultimate makeout song, right? It's like, your parents have left the house, you're there with your boyfriend, you can kind of make out on the couch. I mean, that's sort of like the alone that I think
yeah,
Tiffany
yeah.
was pointing to.
Of course.
But when you take because I think we're alone now.
Yeah,
So it's like the viewer and the cow spirit or
yeah.
what have you. I mean,
I guess we're alone now. And if you read the interview, she has this really, really interesting interview with the Afro-pessimists theorist, Frank B. Wilderson III, in the book. It's right in the middle of the
mm,
book. And this idea that I think we're alone now really speaks to any community. But I think Afro-pessimism has something that really, made me feel made me position myself very clearly, because the Black community is placing themselves so specifically as being completely alone, and you not
mm,
being part of their condition. You will never be part of this condition as a white person. And that was
mhm,
incredibly powerful to read, because they bring it home in a way that really explains this context of having been the slave even before the slave ships that the Portuguese started to, as a trend,
yeah,
my people, they started to
mhm,
to organize, to bring to other colonies, particularly, what is now the USA. But that the slavery thing was already happening before that. So, this otherness of the slave and that body that is so abject that it will always reinforce your privilege or your existence as an existence that creates the structure is so powerful that when I, was reading these texts that she wrote and was reading the interview, I didn't understand everything. It's very dense theory. And it's a theory that also criticizes representation, which is something that is very controversial, I think, within communities that are excluded, not only the Black community, but in art nowadays. We're talking a lot about representation. It was a big deal when the portraits of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama were made by, I forget the name of the artist, but this Black artist who painted the first Black president and the first Black first lady. And that was all about, having Black bodies represented in the museum doors, not as slaves, but as powerful people. And Afro-pessimism kind of interrogates this. And there's even the passage where he talks about what 12 years a slave and how the whipping of that character he thinks does not
Mm.
do what Steve McQueen thinks it's doing. It's actually reinforcing the trope of Black suffering bodies. I Think We're Alone Now, is not specifically there. And I think that's why it's so clever, because you are asking yourself, who is this we? And according to the
Yeah, yeah.
spectator's background, identity, color of their skin, you're going to feel differently, because they even Afropessimism, and that's what really astounded me, is that they separate their thinking from LGBTQIA plus issues, for example, from white female issues, for example. They really construct a territory that is impenetrable. One of the authors they mention is, of course, James Baldwin. And they reject the humanism in James Baldwin, because he says, I love James
Mm.
Baldwin until the end of the books. In the end of the books, he reconnects with humanism, and humanism is built on our backs, and we don't belong there.
Mm. And I mean, I guess sort of in that room, we're in the slaughterhouse in that room, and then there's that doorway at the end that is
We
glowing.
haven't visited the whole exhibition yet. So the second room has these vitrines that look archaeological, or kind of typical of like old historical exhibition spaces. The surface of the table is covered with red velvet with the word vitrine on them with an asterisk, if I'm not. And then they're covered by these huge glass boxes. So they're vitrines, but they're empty.
And they're rectangular as well,
Yes,
so
a
they
bit.
look a bit coffin-like
Yes, they do. They do.
ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a poem on the wall that says vitrine as a sort of asterisk, as a sort of title. And so Aria Dean says that this was her speaking, about her own experience. And so it says, captured air that details an undermining, trickeries against oneself. It is revealed that the melancholic sap, or lover of history, or singer of lament, felled by wars not fought, and hollowed by spectre of lives she did not live, forgets herself and the muck at her ankles, favoring instead the scent of the theft of the wind from over the inverted horizon. So I love this poem.
Hmm.
I love the idea of
Yeah.
inverted horizon.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know. I thought it was nice too that it was like, the text could have easily been, here's what I was thinking, and it's obviously kind of a continuation of her examination of structures and all that, but she didn't. She put this, kind of strange branding vitrine alongside a poem for you to make of what you'd like to.
Yeah, were kind of, in the beginning I was like, oh well, I get it, empty vitrines, I get it, fine. But then I was reminded of a story that a friend told me. This Portuguese artist, Joana Escoval, she went to the United States for some reason, and she ended up going to one of the museums there, maybe the Met, I don't know. And she interviewed a person responsible for some sort of collection. The story is very vague, it was years ago. But the important bit of the story is that this museum curator told her that they had these headdresses from Native Americans still existing, still alive, and practicing the rituals in the United States as exhibition items. And because there's now a culture of giving back these artifacts, they contacted the chief of this particular community, Native American people. And so the person came, and they took out the headdress from this vault at a certain temperature. They opened the boxes really carefully with gloved hands. They put them on the table. And then the dude just took the headdress, put it in a sports bag, put it in his bag, and just left.
What?
Because it's an everyday thing for these
Yeah,
people. Whereas
yeah,
for the white
yeah,
people, it was something
yeah.
very precious, of the past. But
Right.
for them, it's a living thing. It's a thing they use.
I mean, I love that because it's like, there's always that pushback, around the Benin bronzes and stuff. It's like, oh, well, or any of it. It's like, oh, well, if we gave it back, they'd sell it on or da, da, da. It's like, yeah, go for it. They
It's
can.
theirs.
It's
It's
theirs.
theirs. It's
They
none
can
of your
do
business.
what they would like.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's,
And this idea of representation, what do you bring to the exhibition space? And she said something really interesting. She says that she's not interested in what art expresses, she's interested in what art is doing.
that's where I was in seeing this because, immediately my mind is trying to make sense of the film and my mind is trying to make sense of these empty, clear boxes, coffin-like boxes with the red velvet branding on it. And, I think so. I watched the film twice. And when I watched it the second time, I sort of let my mind relax and just be taken through. And then it kind of got quite emotional. And that's when kind of some of the similes with Eras Crossing and other
Yeah.
ways that people and movement is confined and monitored and controlled to such a high degree, and the ways that we build structures to do that. I felt like the second viewing was sort of when that started
Mm.
to sink in. And then when I went to the second room, yeah, my immediate was like, okay, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to make of this. But then it's like after you leave and you're sort of absorbing and amalgamating both things, it's the idea presented in another way. I mean, just that trappedness, that invisibility too, the invisibility of the trappedness. It's the air that's trapped. We don't even see it. We don't even see the air being trapped,
Mm.
and how
Yeah.
profound, that is. So Aria Dean is not shy about naming George Bataille as a huge influence for her. I mean, she has one of her essays in her book Bad Infinity that is in fact called
Black Bataille.
Black Bataille. Yeah, it's written in 2021. And it looks and if you look at any of her stuff online, some of her lectures, etc., she is bound to reference him. And Joanna, I know that you know more about Bataille than I did because you studied philosophy, and he was brand new to me. I literally had never heard of him,
Yeah.
but wow, does he make an impression? Oh my gosh. I mean, essentially, I mean, really, really strange guy, like made some very strange life choices. But essentially he developed this theory of base materialism, and he posited that base matter is in everything and disrupts the division between high and low matter. This counters the idea that matter is a thing in its own right. So I read this article by Evan Jack in Medium that was published in September last year, and it gives an example about what he means, that's based on capitalism. So there's the bourgeois and the middle class, that is high material, high matter rather, and they want to keep the working class separate. So they want to keep low matter separate. So there might be a theory that says that, you know, high matter is a thing in and of itself that is its own thing. But what Bataille would say is that it's impossible to separate high and low, so that in the high there is the lows. So the working class is inseparable from the bourgeois and the middle class, which of course we all know in economy it is, and certainly in capitalism it is. So the thing with Bataille is that this is all transgressive. This
Mm.
is a transgressive thought. So Jack in this article also writes that it's only when one goes towards the limit, then transgresses it, does one quote unquote follow Bataille. And this explains the human sacrifice stuff
What do
because,
you mean by
yes,
human
this is a
sacrifice?
guy, Bataille, who was into that. He was interested in, transgressing that line. And he had a club of people that were like, hey, we'd be up to be the subjects of human sacrifice. And they tried to get someone who would be up for being the executioner for
It
this
was a
group of
group
people.
called
And they didn't find it.
Acéphale. Yeah, the group was called
Okay,
Acéphale, so
yeah.
acephalous, which means without a head. So someone would have cut
Yeah.
the head somehow. And it is really an ethos of transgression, if one may use this oxymoron. It is, yeah, it's a literature of transgression. And he was indeed a strange dude who was practicing strange stuff at the time. This is alleged, so I don't know to what extent this
Yeah,
is
sure.
real or not, but no wonder, there was some rumors about, Bataille, because he also wrote Histoire de l'œil, so I don't know how it is translated, the history of the eye, maybe, which is all about
Mm.
transgressive sexualities and sexual imaginaries and actions and gestures. And I have this thing where, when you tell me something, I believe you. Is it Mae West that when people tell you who they are, believe them? I believe him. I think he was this transgressive dude, and there were many places and still are in society where, you practice transgression, and you can practice transgression by, yeah, and it's interesting because what is transgression? I think that's what the question, and that's why Aria Dean enters, because, if you're a Mormon, is it Mormons who can be married to lots of women? I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
right. That's okay. It's part of a religious structure, so it's part of the structure, so it's okay. But then, if someone's in a throuple, and they decide to, and they hold hands, the three of them, and kiss each other in public, then, oh, that's not good. That's not good. That will
Yeah.
not happen in society. So this, what is transgression and what is the structure of society? He went very, very far. He goes into mutilation and to all sorts of things that are quite, for lack of a better word, very, very creepy to me. But he does come from, and he did influence Foucault and Lacan and all of these people. I think also materialism is something that interests Aria Dean, and as opposed to symbolism. So again, this idea of the fact that everything is active in society, is an active agent. So it's real, and it's, it acts upon society, and it acts upon structures, or is structural, rather than, expression and symbolism, art as being something that kind of stays away from the real, from reality, which Nabokov always said, you when you write reality, you have to put it into, between quotes, because
Yeah.
why? Everything is,
What is it?
he was probably a
Yeah.
materialist
Yeah.
as well. There's no such thing as reality. We're in it. This is it, you know. And so she's, and she wrote this famous text called, Poor Meme, Rich Meme. Is that it? Let me check. I have the book right here.
Yeah,
Poor
that's
Meme,
one of
Rich
the
Meme.
very early
Yeah,
ones.
in
Yeah.
2016. And she was talking about these Black youths who were using social media. So memes, of course, are now a forgotten thing, or almost prehistoric. But back in 2016, it was a thing that was happening, and everyone was using them. And Black people were creating it, Black young people. And she talks about how instantly those creative processes from these Black people were incorporated in something that is corporate, that is an entity that immediately owns whatever they produce. So they're caught in this loop, in this bad infinity, let's say, where they're immediately dispossessed. And dispossession is something that's really interesting for her. And she mentions this in, a situation that happened at the Whitney Biennial. I think it was the 2017 Whitney Biennial,
Mm,
where Dana Schutz,
yeah.
who's an incredibly successful painter, and a white woman, decided to paint the image of the poor 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, who was brutally,
Hmm.
viciously murdered because a white woman said that accused him of harassing her.
Like winking at her or something
Was it a
really,
wink?
really, you know,
Oh,
it was like it
how
was
dare
really
he?
it was like a small gesture from memory, and it wasn't even true.
And it was,
The woman who accused
yeah.
him finally admitted in the end that he didn't even do it, but
Anyway,
yeah,
so he was
anyway, but so
brutalized, brutally murdered, and there's an image of him in his casket, I think, and completely disfigured. And she painted this image. And Hannah Black, particularly this British black artist, said that the painting should not be there; it should be removed because that was not, her story to take. And Dana Schutz replied that the painting was not for sale, it would never be for sale. But there was a big uproar, and Aria Dean participated in this uproar. And in a conference, she said, well, I was on the side of Hannah Black. I was one of those people, full disclosure, who was not happy with this painting being at the Whitney Biennial. But then it kind of got away. This became a huge discussion about can a white woman paint a black child, which is not the thing that interested me. So, what interested her was the notion of dispossession and the notion that, as a black person who inherited this history and who is a victim of this history, maybe not a victim, but subjected to uh, in their own bodies, in your own body, you are dispossessed somehow of that story. And it is difficult to understand this. And I kept thinking about this. I have to be honest. It's not; these things are not easy to understand. And it's important to talk about them. And I think we may get some things right here, wrong here, and while we talk. But
sure,
it
yeah.
is important to understand this experience. And the only parallel I could come to was that a friend of mine, a very close friend, very dear friend, is responsible for this football team, and he sent me a logo. He was designing a logo for the football team, and it was a dog, a female dog, a bitch, you call them, being
Mm.
breastfeeding her little cubs. And I looked at that image and I was so enraged. And we had this huge WhatsApp fight. Exchange of views. And I said, like, I'm so sick of men appropriating breastfeeding as a sort of wholesome image, is dispossessing me of my experience and the politics of breastfeeding, which are so incredibly vicious, at the moment. And so we had this huge discussion, and it's the only thing that I can, again, thinking of Afropessimism as a white feminist, this is not the same. It's not the same experience, but in
Yeah.
trying to understand what dispossession means.
And that's what I found interesting about that lecture where she talks about this was exactly what you're saying, the notion of, not trying to say who has the rightful property to represent what, but she made the point that, look, we're at the Whitney, we're at the biennial, not just anyone can show here, but white people more so,
Yes.
and and that's part of the issue here, is the fact of, you know that black artists are not represented in these spaces as much, so therefore a white woman takes this, Emmett Till image, and
And when they are represented, they are tokenized. And I think that's the issue. Is that even
yeah,
now as a curator, you have to think, do I have trans bodies? Do I have, trans experiences? Do I have female experiences? Do I have black experiences? Do I have Latina experience? Do I have Asian experiences? But it takes a long time as a curator myself to represent, not to represent, but to present uh, different experiences as artists. You have to take time and listen and see what that experience is. And the thing now with the art world is that, no, yeah, you do have Black artists in exhibitions, but they're immediately tokenized. There's maybe some self tokenization, which I think is what the theorist she interviews alluded to when he was talking about 12 years a slave. That's how I understood it. I don't know. I don't think that's my
Mm.
place to say. He doesn't say it like that, but that's kind of how I interpreted it. I may be wrong. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. That's, I mean, I just think that juxtaposition between who has the right to represent something and what is the space to represent
Mm, yes.
was kind of, that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think that's a really helpful nuance,
Hmm.
because of course a painter can paint whatever they want, right? We don't want to start policing what someone can put down on canvas. And I, from what I understood of Aria Dean's commentary, that's exactly where she is too, as you've mentioned. But it's more about, who has the opportunity to. And if it were a level playing field and there was just as many Black artists at the Whitney Biennial and most biennials and in the establishment, different story perhaps.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
no, I thought that was a really, I am, in the polarized politics of the day,
Yeah.
is really nice to hear her work that through in a way that yeah, just felt more engaged and nuanced than it very easily could have been.
Hmm. I don't know if that
Yeah.
she's nuanced. When you read her, you see that she is so extreme. That's what I enjoyed in her work. I think she's just precise. She's precise in what she's saying.
Mm.
But in the interview, Frank B. Wilderson III does say, why are people happy when we complain, but then they're not happy when we're violent? You know, and that's a question. We're not happy when we claim a space for ourselves. There's this discomfort, when you claim a space for yourself because you cannot exist otherwise. And it's, again, I know, but they would hate the parallel I'm making, but I'm trying to understand. There's in Hampstead Heath, there's the swimming pools for men,
Yeah.
swimming pools for women, and then the mixed one. And I remember going to the women one, kind of grumpy and thinking, oh, where am I? What is this segregation? But it was the closest one to the male one. So part of the family went to the male one, and my daughter and I went to the female one. And it was the most delightful experience ever.
Hmm.
The behavior was different. The way you presented your body was different. It was such a good space. And
Yeah.
now I'm completely for it. And I wasn't, I was like the cool girl, we can all be together. But actually, it is sometimes really important to just behave in a different way. And of course, there's a lot of desire. There's
Mhm.
a lot of lesbians there. It's not about desire. It's more
Sure.
complex than that.
Yeah.
And I love that she goes into that complexity. I think she's going to change a lot. Her mind's so young. I'm really curious to see where she's going.
Looking at the essays and looking how much she's developed her thinking in these, in the span of the essays, which I think is like 5, 6 years or
Yeah.
something like that, and imagining where she's going to go from there. And I really liked, I mean, obviously we're talking about the piece as an Aria Dean piece, the video, which of course it is, but all of the artists that were involved in it
Mm.
as well. I mean, the game software developers, the composer. I mean, it was just such a collaborative effort as well.
All right. So this is a wrap, isn't it? We've come to the end of it. I think much more could have been said, but
Because she has so much written work, I mean, it's she has visual stuff, but obviously a lot of, yeah, written work. And then, I mean, she references a lot of other folks like George Bataille, and Robert Morris, who was another huge influence of hers. So I felt like you're kind of getting to know her, but you're also spinning off into all these different directions, which was great. I mean, it was sort of feed that into the fertile mind, it was good.
I have a question to you. All this theory, did it affect your experience of the exhibition?
That's a good question. I don't think it did. I had, I think, a profound experience at the watching the film because of, my own experiences and, just kind of turning off my brain, as it were, trying to figure it out and what it is and what she's trying to do with it. But I don't know maybe if I went back, and saw the video again, it would inform a different experience. But I think because I saw it before all of that, and I had, quite I had an experience in and of itself without all of the theory. I'm not sure. It changes that experience.
I think people are a bit weary of artists who are theorists as well. You write, theorize, and I think that's the strong point of her work, is that the theory is the theory, the writing is the writing, and the experience of the artwork is the experience of the artwork. And she produces these experiences that are separate from her writing. If you haven't read, her thoughts on materialism versus symbolism, all of those things, you still have an incredible experience that is not too far away from where she places and positions herself. So it's an effective, artistic, creative work that will not
Yeah,
be
totally.
explained by whatever you read from her and therefore resolved. So we've come to the end of our episode, and our next episode is going to be focusing on the solo show of Zainab Saleh at the Tate Britain. The exhibition's open until the 23rd of June, so you have a lot of time to visit it still. Leave us a review. We have a couple, but maybe more would be of use. That helps, believe it or not, it really helps to support the podcast. And, this season will be over at the end of July, but we will come back in September with season 2. So that also depends on you. Leave us a review or at least rate us. Of course, 5 stars minimum. You can go up to 6 if you want. But yeah, just support us. That really means a lot to us.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. Have a great week and see you next time.
See you next time, Emily. Always a pleasure. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.